Good morning and welcome to the State of K-12 during COVID-19. My name is Dr. Carl Tishner from the Indiana Youth Institute, and I will be your moderator for this session. Just a few housekeeping rules before we start. Remember, if you have a question, please type it in the chat box and we will get to you as many as possible at the end of the session. We anticipate asking the last question around 10:15. Also, please remember to complete the session survey. Many of you were unable to complete that. Please note that it will be in the chat box throughout the session and definitely at the end of the session to give you an opportunity to complete prior to ending this session. Without further ado, please welcome Robin LeClaire. Robin LeClaire, Chief Academic Officer at the Indiana Department of Education, has been working in public education for over a quarter of a century. As a classroom teacher for 14 years, she taught grades 1, 2, 4, and 5 in a diverse urban setting. She moved into administration and served as the Dean of Students for 2 years and Principal for 8 years. During her tenure in school, she helped turn a failing school around and helped to close the achievement gap among underperforming student groups. In her current role, she oversees curriculum and instruction, social-emotional behavioral wellness, school improvement, leadership and innovation, special education, school safety, and title grants, to name a few. Robin has presented nationally on improving school culture in order to raise student achievement and presents across the state on topics such as MTSS, pushing for proficiency and bullying. Her goal as Chief Academic Officer for the department is to provide educators with high-quality resources, guidance, professional development, and supports they need to be successful to serve the 1.2 million students in Indiana. Robin?
Good morning. Thank you so much. I am very honored and excited to be here this morning with all of you. I have been the Chief Academic Officer at the department for just a few months, although I've been at the department almost 3 years, and am excited to share with you about the state of K-12 education. I'm sorry that I'm having to share that in light of COVID-19, and sorry that we could not all be together in person this morning and instead virtual, but still looking forward to thinking about what school can look like for our students. So I want to share with you some information about how the department has gone about addressing education concerns since the start of COVID-19. As soon as schools closed in March, we set 4 priorities: ensuring essential resources for our schools and students, providing academic support, engaging educators, and providing guidance for families and staff and administrators. We've held to those 4 buckets as we've moved through COVID-19. It seems like now we've been doing this for a really long time and not sure when the end will come. So it's important for us to keep our priorities in order and to continue to reach out to school districts and provide the kind of support they need to make our students successful. So the first thing we wanted to look at was ensuring essential resources. We know that our students in K-12 rely on schools for many of their essential resources. For their food, for childcare, for health needs, and many of our families rely on us for financial support. So we started looking at the food. How can we still have students being fed every day? And schools around the state stepped up with the help of a USDA waiver that allowed us to provide students food outside of the school and to be delivered in multiple days at a time to help make sure that our students were fed. This was important for many students whose parents may have lost their jobs and were in financial hardships as well, making sure that we had our students with the kind of nutrition that they needed to carry out the e-learning and remote learning experiences that were provided. Childcare was another concern, with many of our parents as essential workers and students no longer in school. We wanted to make sure there were safe places for students to go during the day and be supervised. So we put out guidance for child care centers to open safely, and for schools, although campuses being closed, to open if the need for child care for essential workers existed. Many of our students were receiving things like occupational therapy, speech therapy, mental health services from school. When school closed and school buildings were no longer open, we helped facilitate telehealth in order to continue to provide this continuity of service for our students. Now, as we look to the opening of a new school year, we are helping to provide PPE kits, including masks for students, masks for visitors, hand sanitizer, and such things for schools. We've been working on having schools sign up for that and the logistics of delivering those items to over 700 locations throughout the state. That's no easy feat. I'm the chief academic officer, and all of a sudden I'm running logistics for a big trucking company or something. That was not necessarily one of my strengths, but just like everybody else around the state, our educators who've stepped up to do something they've never done before, that they weren't trained to do and didn't really want to do, we're all stepping up and doing the same thing. We've provided guidance to families and to educators as they look at ways to reopen schools, and then some financial support through CARES funding and through grants to help schools in these difficult times provide the things they need for their staff and families. Also, we looked at our students who were recipients of free and reduced lunch and worked with FSSA and the federal government to provide EBT cards in the amount of $319 per child in food subsidies for parents to purchase food for students. So that's kind of a recap of where we were back in March and where we are today in ensuring essential resources for our students. Now, my passion and what I really wanted to make sure we kept on track was providing academic support back in March and again now as we look to open a school year. We want to keep kids on track and engaged in learning. What I know about educators in Indiana is that they are committed to student learning. Whether it's virtual, whether it's in person, whether they have to do it from a rooftop, our teachers, our educators are committed to student learning. And with that commitment, I know that we can have a successful school year no matter how we begin and when we get to the middle and finally to the end of this pandemic. So one goal of the Department of Education is to make sure that when we go back to school this school year, 2 weeks, I keep saying back to school this school year like it's such a long way away, in 2 weeks or 3 weeks, that even though we know students have some loss of math and language arts, that we're not focused on just remediation, but we have to be doing some acceleration at the same time. So we look at the primary focus of remediation being to master the concepts of the past, but acceleration is going to prepare students for success in the present. Right now, this content, what are we working on? So we want to make sure that instead of concentrating on what students have not mastered, that we're accelerating and readying students for the new learning that's coming their way. We will have to address past skills, but in the context of future learning. And that is what we are trying to stress with our educators. We want to make sure that we are thoughtfully selecting what we need to work on and that we reject deficit mindsets that students can't do grade level work because they were out of school or in a different setting for 2 months. We want to make sure that we select skills and content thoughtfully and teach those in context that brings everything together and not in isolation. Because if we focus on remediation, we will be playing catch up with our students until they graduate. It will widen the achievement gap for our most vulnerable populations that already have an achievement gap existing. We need to look at the inequities that COVID has highlighted. COVID didn't bring the inequities were here, but they've been highlighted and exacerbated. And then we need to make sure we have activities and experiences for students that will stimulate their thinking and scaffold for them to help fill in those missing pieces. TNTP put out a report recently that was their Opportunity Growth Part 2 that talked about some of the inequities and achievement gaps that have existed, and why, if we go with traditional remediation methods of meeting students where they are, will be in a vicious cycle for the next 12 years with our students. All of our students, teachers, administration, and families are facing loss and trauma right now. From March to now, we have been in a period of loss, and we need to understand that this creates an environment of stress and anxiety about our school year ahead. So we cannot have business as usual as our mentality. We have to overcome that. So we look at not just doubling down on current strategies, not just doing more of the same, but looking at a fundamentally different strategy for diagnosing lost learning and putting every student on a fast track back to grade level proficiency. So we need a strategy for acceleration, a springboard, if you will. Again, this is most important for our most vulnerable populations. Students who already have achievement gaps, if we meet them where they are and only move at the same pace, then we're going to be cheating those students out of finding the potential that they are destined for. So we need to make sure we're not focusing just on what they missed, but on what we want them to know. We shouldn't be going back, even if we're starting virtually, we shouldn't be going back a grade level or a quarter to try to make up what was lost. We have to move forward. This is a chance to focus on having a guaranteed and viable curriculum and evidence-based instructional practices for all of our students. So the guiding principles that we, the Department of Education, are pushing out to our schools is grade level content is the academic priority. We must utilize grade level content for our students. We cannot give them work from the grade level behind and hope to catch them up. That will be a never-ending cycle for us. We need to communicate and acknowledge the existing inequities and opportunity gaps. When we talked about ensuring essential resources, we had school districts where it was imperative to get food out to students. In other communities, that may not have been the focus, and they may have been able to focus more on academic achievement and growth. So now that we're back together in whatever format, whether it's virtual, whether it's in person, whether it's a hybrid, we have to talk about the opportunity gaps that exist, the inequities that exist, and make sure that our plan for reentry supports academic and social emotional growth, and we address the needs of our students and our families. That is the utmost important aspect. And then we need to make sure that our reentry plan provides the necessary support for our teachers and school leaders. Every stakeholder should be at the table in the reentry plans. I read a quote on Twitter, which amused me a little bit, but fits in here well, that said, if you don't have a seat at the table, you're on the menu. That is what's going to happen if we don't bring everybody to the table and make sure they all have the training they need to support their students in this time of loss, their social emotional needs, and their academic needs. And we have to assume that all of our stakeholders, our parents, our students, our teachers, our administrators, are doing the very best that they can and that they know how. When you know better, you do better. So we have to have everybody at the table talking about the reentry plan and providing that support and making sure that our decisions are transparent to all of our stakeholders. We need a guaranteed and viable curriculum because that is the heart of instruction. We need to make sure that we are giving all students the opportunity to learn, that we're focusing on Indiana academic standards and have an emphasis on high priority standards. I have a school improvement team that is providing professional development to any staff who wants it on emphasizing and identifying high priority standards. And if you're interested in having that training for your school, you can contact us and we will get that scheduled for you. We need to make sure our lessons are laid out systematically and sequentially to engage students and provide opportunity for mastery. There has to be time for teachers and for students to learn, to grow, to ask questions, and that time is given to focus on those high priority standards. So we have to look through two lenses: a horizontal articulation, what is learned across the grade from lesson to lesson and month to month, and vertical articulation, what's learned across grades and years. Vertical articulation has never been more important than it is right now during this time of COVID. We have to know what students should have been learning from March to the end of the year so that we can help them close those gaps as we make sure we're headed towards the finish line of what they need to know at the end of this year, regardless of the setting that we're in. And if this looks familiar to you, the source is from Marzano's Teaching Best Practices. This isn't new and this wasn't developed because of COVID. However, it has never been more important than it is now in the time of COVID to make sure that we are focusing on these best practices. Our next bucket was engaging educators. Ensuring academic growth for our students is important, and in order to do that, we have to engage educators. Students don't learn without teachers. We have to have teachers and they have to have relationships with their students, and that's what creates an environment for learning to grow. We, in science class back in 7th, 8th grade, I learned to grow penicillin in a petri dish when the conditions were just right for that growth to take place. For our students' growth to take place in a time of COVID, the environment will have to be just right. So the Department of Education wants to engage educators by delivering professional development and helping teachers deliver instruction in the very best way to enhance education for students. So here are some things that we have put out to help educators. These are all on our website, and they are all available to everyone: parents, students, teachers, administrators. Right now, getting a classroom ready has never been more complex. You might be in a hybrid model, so you're trying to get your on-site classroom ready, you're trying to get your virtual classroom ready. You're thinking about types of supplies needed that have never been needed before. You're looking at possibly planning lessons for students on-site and virtual. The burden on educators, and I'm talking about administrators and teachers, has never been greater. And the importance of being successful at it has never been greater. So what we want to do here at the department is create resources that can lighten your load just a little bit, so that you aren't all, educators across this state, reinventing every single wheel every single day. So we have created continuous learning weekly challenges. These are things that students can do off-site. They are not connected to a device or Wi-Fi. They are real learning, engaging activities. They're tied to our Indiana academic standards, and they're tied to Michael Fullen's work on deep learning. We have many weeks available. Students can do all or some. They can be used as choice boards, however educators want to use them. So I encourage you to find those and use those ready-made activities, ready to distribute to students, to lighten your load a little bit, and know that those are grade level appropriate, they're rigorous, and they're intended to help our students grow. We've created a family engagement toolkit. Family engagement is also critical at this time. We need our families' commitments to whatever reentry plan each school has in order for it to be successful. So this family engagement toolkit has resources for you as educators, you as schools, to use to help engage families in a time where families may not be able to come into your building at all. You may not meet a family face-to-face for the next 9 weeks. Depending on what it looks like in your community, this toolkit could be a key to successful relationships with your families. We have a principal toolkit created by 2 of our directors who are former principals and who know the challenges of being a school leader. This has some articles and resources for you to use as you look to navigate your time in K-12 education during the time of COVID. We have a resources database that is searchable by grade level and by subject area. All kinds of resources for each standard, for each grade level, for each subject area that are both online and in person are available to you. So when you're looking for activities to support your curriculum, to support Indiana academic standards, to support rigorous student growth, these resources have been vetted by our staff and we've combed all 50 states looking for these resources. If you have a resource you want to share, you could submit it for us to add to the database. Then we have a roadmap for social emotional learning reentry. Social emotional learning had become a priority over the past few years. And now that we see what COVID has done with some of our students' social emotional wellness and our staff social emotional wellness, we need to focus on this area. We worked with other state agencies like the Department of Health and DMHA to come up with this reentry plan for SEL that provides a guidance for educators to look into this SEL realm as we go back. We need to focus on academics, but we need to do so in that environment that I talked about, that perfect environment for growth that has to include addressing social emotional needs. And a lot of that is for our educators. Educators, you have to feed your soul. You have to acknowledge your needs. We have our Science of Happiness for Teachers class that's all virtual. It's a few modules, 45 minutes. You can actually earn 90 PGP points if you want to take it, but it helps you rewire and concentrate and focus on your social emotional wellness. We've also released that class for secondary students, grades 7 through 12. But I really want educators to think about how you're focusing on your social emotional wellness. Many of you are parents as well as educators, and you are balancing a whole lot right now, and you need to acknowledge that. Because by you being well, you can help students be well. Providing guidance and producing guidance for the field was another one of our buckets. We wanted to make sure that we address some of the questions and concerns on operations and procedures. So we have created our continuous learning guidance. Every state kind of put out something a little bit different in this realm, and I highly encourage you to look at it because it addresses a lot of the operations that you're dealing with, grading and attendance, and how do we what kind of time do we have students spend on activities. So take a look at that because it'll give you a lot of guidance for continuous learning. And it addresses how we are looking at students in our most vulnerable populations. In our populations of students that have an existing achievement gap, what are some considerations for those students? Our in-class reentry plan for the state, that's guidance that many schools are using to develop their own reentry plans, is available. It has an entire appendix on special education, an entire appendix on extracurricular and sports activities. We have our COVID-19 FAQ. As you can imagine, we've had many questions coming in since March, and we've tried to keep that updated so you can look for any topics and hopefully find your answers. Our McKinney-Vento homeless foster students, we have a document for considerations for those students during COVID, and our English learner considerations. Recently, in the weekly message that Dr. McCormick puts out an email every Friday, and if you're not signed up for that, I highly encourage you to go on the website and get signed up for her weekly message, because we put all of these documents, all of these resources in it every week, and also special announcements and timelines and calendars. But there's also, this past week, we had a memo in there about what does academic engagement look like and what are the requirements for instructional time. With many of our schools looking at a virtual option, either as a hybrid or as a choice for students and parents who don't feel comfortable coming back to in-person school. There are requirements from the state about instructional time that students must spend in order for a day to be considered a day. We have a requirement of 180 days, and in those days, our elementary students need 5 hours of instruction. Our secondary students need 6. What does that look like in a virtual environment? Does that mean that all students need to be in front of a computer screen or a packet at the exact same time, synchronously, if you will? What counts as instructional time in a virtual environment? When you look at our academic engagement memo, it talks about what is academic engagement. Students being active in a learning activity or project. So it doesn't have to be synchronous. In fact, it very well may be asynchronous, especially if a teacher is teaching an in-person class at one period of time and a virtual class at another period of time. It's entirely likely that students are going to be needing to do things on their own. So counting that into instructional time in order for the day to be considered a day means that students need to be engaged in the activity. It doesn't necessarily mean that the teacher and student are in the same place at the same time. So those are some guidance documents that we've put out and that I encourage you to look at as we embark on this next school year, whatever that may look like in your community. Although this session was titled State of K-12 Education and COVID-19, I would be very remiss if I ignored the social justice and civil rights activities and movement that's happening in our state and all states in the country right now. I want to bring to your attention the resources that we have available for you as educators as you look to navigate these social justice and civil rights activities, these topics, these questions in your classroom as we move forward. COVID-19 is one major issue facing our nation right now. Social justice and civil rights is as well. So we have a civil rights and ethnic education resources page and a cultural competency page that has resources for educators, resources for students, articles, and activities, and best practices. We have a comprehensive positive school discipline resource guide that helps make sure our discipline policies in our schools do not violate civil rights and do not marginalize student populations. We have an achievement gap that can be exacerbated by poor discipline protocols. So we want to make sure that we use research-based positive discipline philosophies. This Friday in Dr. McCormick's weekly message, we'll be releasing a bibliography that is aligned to our social emotional learning competencies and our desire to have discussions about race in the classroom. These book lists have hundreds of books that are separated by grade band. So if you're a pre-K teacher, if you're a K-2 teacher, if you're a 3-6 teacher, a 7-12 teacher, we have books separated by grade band and Lexile that help enhance discussions about race in the classroom. And that's a one-stop shop for you, for SEL and for books about race in the classroom to find easily. We also have a webinar about how to facilitate conversations about race in your classroom. Next week at 10 o'clock. It's already got over 200 people signed up for this webinar. And we hope to have even more. We're going to open up a second day to have this live webinar, and then it's also recorded if people can't attend. It's a 2-hour webinar about how to facilitate conversations about race in your classroom. When we talk about transparency and bringing people to the table and addressing all needs, this is important. I want to thank you for attending today, and hopefully I've been able to provide a look at K-12 education in the time of COVID. I am a fan of The Big Bang Theory, and I watched an episode where Sheldon was trying to take Bernadette's mind off of her late delivery of her child, and he brought over a game, and he said this game about the elections in South America take about 5 to 6 weeks to play. And they had been at it for a little bit, and someone spoke to Bernadette, and she said, you know, I can't talk right now. I'm in the middle of a game. And Sheldon laughed and said, oh, that's so cute. We're hundreds of hours away from the middle of the game. And that's how I feel about COVID. We have no idea on the continuum whether we're at the beginning, the middle, or towards the end. We may be hundreds of hours from the middle, or we may be right around the corner from it. Either way, the Department of Education is ready to support educators and students and families as we navigate these new environments to grow our students every day. Thank you.
Thank you, Robin, for that excellent presentation. We naturally have several questions that have been asked during your presentation. I do want to provide a statement of logistics just quickly, as part of your presentation wasn't being shown during the presentation. And so just note that IBE will have this recording on their YouTube website or site. So please feel free to check out Robin's comments there, as well as the PowerPoint will be available at that point. Now, I want to ask a question that was highlighted a few times, about 32 times. So how do you plan to address the possible behavioral issues that may arise due to students being out of school for an extended period of time? What is the guidance that IDOE has for them?
Well, I think that is where our social, emotional, behavior, and wellness proactive work will be important. We need to address with students what expectations there are. We need to continue to be in contact with our students, whether it's virtually or in person, to help those students know what expectations there are. And then we need to be clear with our administrators about how we're going to deal with those discipline issues that may come up. I especially think about our young learners, our students who haven't even really started school yet, our kindergartners, maybe our first graders who didn't get to finish the year, and their lack of understanding of the student role. And then being out of school for an extended period of time and coming back and having to learn that student role, I think what we have to do is continue to model and set expectations. Having been a teacher for 14 years, I know that we still have our students who are going to struggle with that and are going to test our patience. And just like when we're in the classroom and there's not a one size fits all to address that, it's the same with COVID. Whether you're virtual or in person, there are going to be behaviors, and we're going to have to be A, proactive, and then B, have a plan and be ready to address those with all stakeholders, talking with families and administrators.
Thank you, and that makes a lot of sense. And part of the follow-up question to this one is, how will you ensure that appropriate social emotional support during the transition back to school, specifically for resources allocated towards school psychologists, counselors, and those who are in the mental health realm to support school teachers during that time?
So we had just finished a legislative session when COVID sort of took hold, and luckily our legislators had just passed a law that schools have to enter into agreements with mental health professionals. And so our schools should be having those mental health professionals. With the CARES money from the federal government, we're hoping that money, a lot of it is spent for social emotional supports. The Department of Education has an entire social emotional wellness team led by Christy Berger. And we're one of the only states that has that. When we hired Christy and started this team, no other state in the country had a social emotional team. So Indiana was out in front of that, and they stand ready to work with school districts and help them navigate this. The SEL reentry plan that I addressed in the presentation is a big piece of helping schools navigate that social emotional learning piece. So I encourage you to contact Christy and her team to look at that SEL reentry plan and to work with your schools and the staff that they have on hand, and start to, as they start to look at how this will work for our students who need that support.
Next question is from Sarah. As you think about the vertical alignment, and I'm adding that part to it, as you think about the vertical alignment that you mentioned, is there going to be guidance from IDE related to instructional time being added to the school calendar to make up the lost learning time?
I do not think, so instructional time is actually legislated. So the legislature would actually have to pass a law to increase the instructional time requirements. School districts could do that on their own. School districts could decide we need this extra time, but to make a statewide mandate, that would require the passing of a law. So the answer to that is no, there's not really discussion right now of that happening, not to say that it may not happen in the future, but school districts may be doing it. So the guidance that we're providing is on accelerating learning in the time that we have in whatever environment you're working in. And there is a video that has been released and is on our website about that remediation to acceleration that I spoke about. I gave kind of a brief overview, but there's an entire video for teachers that they can use as professional development, and watch that video to see what they may be able to do to increase student learning.
So George asked a question, and this is specific to COVID. In response to if a teacher contracts COVID, what should be some suggested protocols for substitute teachers or the school at large to support that teacher, that classroom, in the instance when that does happen, as we anticipate in the future?
So the in-class reentry document from the state, which is on our website, which has been released to all schools, does address what happens when you have an outbreak of COVID, whether it's a staff member, whether it's a student, whether it's exposure, whether it's a coach, all those things. And the Department of Education is partnering with the Indiana State Department of Health, and we have committed to allowing them to answer the questions related to health. So if you have a teacher in a classroom who tests positive, has been exposed, or comes down with symptoms of COVID, what happens to the students in that classroom, to the other teachers who may be in contact with that teacher, and as far as bringing in a sub and continuing classes, those are things that'll be discussed with your county health department, and they should have a plan for you. And they'll look at different pieces. How many students are they in contact with? Are masks being worn? Is the person testing positive, or have they just been exposed, or are they showing symptoms? And then there will be a decision about how many students, if any, need to be quarantined, how long that classroom has to be shut down, cleaned before you can even bring a sub in, and they will help iron out those details.
Thank you. Josh asked a question and several people supported this question. So it's related to, again, that vertical alignment, but it's really specifically focused on the achievement gap. So as we think about the acceleration and teaching at grade level, what does it mean to respond to the students who are already experiencing that achievement gap? What does that look like, and what are some thoughts you have related to that?
So I think that's when we have to look at skill deficits being addressed in context of present learning. So how can you take present learning, grade level learning, rigorous learning, and address a student's skill gap? One of the most important parts of this will be in diagnosing skill deficits from the jump when school begins, using whatever tools you as a teacher or your district has decided is appropriate, diagnosing those learning gaps, and then addressing those through using grade level material. So if you're a 5th grade teacher and you have students who are missing some third grade skills, so you are going to need to provide teaching and instruction on those skills that are missing in the context of 5th grade material, so we're constantly pushing students. Even in a time of not COVID, we're tempted to remediate students by meeting them back where they are and giving them less rigorous material in order to move them forward. And sometimes you do have to take a step back in order to take 2 steps forward. But if you take that step back, you have to be prepared for the 2 steps forward. You can't stay in the back. This is a simplistic answer to a complex question that I could probably teach an entire class on. So I feel like I'm answering in a simplistic manner. We have a teaching and learning team, both a digital teaching and learning team and an on-site traditional teaching and learning team that stands ready to help any teachers that want to talk about how they can move students forward, how they can accelerate learning, what resources are best to do that. They can provide professional development for staff or one-on-one conversations.
So a simple question for you is, folks are actually going to see those links that you mentioned. So what is the simplest way for them to access the different resources you mentioned?
If they go to IDOE homepage And then over to the side, they can click on, there's like COVID-19 learning resources. They can type in the name of the link. Will this presentation be shared with all the folks who have attended? Because those links are live.
I believe that is the case. And so IBE has mentioned that they can do that, and they will do
Okay.
that.
And so if they go to the homepage and go to COVID-19 resources, they'll be there, or they could type in the title of the link that I have on the presentation, or if they have the presentation, they can click and those will be live. And they can also email me and I can send them to the right location.
Perfect, perfect. So as you continue to think about the thought about cultural relevant pedagogy, can you just speak a little bit about how important that is and some strategies to really engage students in that conversation? I know there's resources for teachers, but there are limited opportunities for professional learning for teachers to prepare them for conversations that are difficult. Can you talk more about the state's response to that and what schools can do to really support the teacher to have those important conversations?
Absolutely, and I don't think there's been a more important time to include culturally relevant curriculum and teaching practices than it is right now. I'm going to say in advance, again, this is a complex question with a simplistic answer since we have a hard stop at a certain time here. So I do encourage you to take advantage of the professional development we offer and the resources. But one of the things that we need to do is start looking at our curriculum materials and asking, how does this material reflect not only the students in my classroom, because many of our curriculum materials do not reflect the students that are in our classroom, but how do they reflect all cultures in our state? Because you might be in a school district that only has certain groups of students, and so you may not see the need to have that culturally relevant curriculum. But it is important that we look at our curriculum and we see what we need to add to this to make it reflective of the cultures of Indiana, and especially the cultures that we have in our classroom. What materials can we pull in to make these things relevant to our students? And then learning about those so that we can teach them in a way that connects to our students of many cultures. And some of that is working with other colleagues and looking at some research about the best practices for teaching students of all cultures, and really looking at the data of your school and what achievement gaps exist so that you can address those particular areas with students with high expectation for achievement, and making sure that your teaching is also relevant to the students you have in your classroom.
Thank you. We have just a few minutes left, and knowing that you have a hard stop today. So I want to be mindful of that, but also make sure that we ask some additional questions that I think folks would love answers to. So additional question comes up is, what will be some important strategies toward promoting acceleration while addressing academic slides? And this is connected to a previous question, but you mentioned new ways to diagnose lost learning. What would some of that look like in particular?
I think as you're looking to diagnose losses, some of your students are going to be virtual and not able to take, a big diagnostic test. And so some of those are going to be quick checks, looking at skills. What questions can we ask students and get quick responses to find out if they have developed these skills? So a lot of these things are going to be quick checks. There's many tools out there such as NWEA and MClass and things like that people are used to using with reports and with groupings of students and addressing standards. And some of those things will not be available when we have our students online and when we have our students that may not be able to take some of those online things. So we aren't going to have those resources at our fingertips like we have had. So we need to find, looking at our Indiana academic standards, our high priority standards, and then identifying those high priority standards and looking at our students and finding quick checks to find out what are the skill gaps. And then finding ways to group students based on skill not based on level. We don't want to have our high students, our low students, our middle students, but we want to have students that are missing this skill. We can teach in this context to accelerate. These students who are missing this skill, we can use this context, and differentiating our learning for students. Again, we have some resources and some staff members who can help specifically with some of those planning pieces, but we need to make sure that once we find out, once you diagnose it, once you get your quick checks, that then you have a plan to address filling that gap with students using appropriate curriculum and instruction. One of the things I didn't mention as a resource is we've used some of the CARES money that was given to the state to partner with the Partnership for Inquiry Learning out of Butler University to create ready-made videos tied to Indiana academic standards on math and language arts by grade band. We'll have 20 videos for language arts and 20 for math, connected directly to Indiana academic standards, that teachers can use. They're ready-made for teaching some of those standards and helping address some of the learning gaps. And so some of those resources are going to be invaluable. We also have a digital learning toolkit that's going to be released this Friday for those teachers who are going to be trying to navigate the digital teaching world, whether hybrid or 100%, for best practices.
Excellent. And the last question here, for sake of time, is specific to exceptional learners. As we think about the transition potentially to hybrid models for schools, how are we addressing the needs of exceptional learners in that thought process?
Great question. I'm glad that that came up, because I think that's going to be a group of students we need to make sure we're focused on and not letting that fall to the wayside because of students that need help in filling achievement gaps or growth. We need to make sure we're focusing on continuing to enrich our students who have been identified as high ability. Schools have some high ability money that's given to them by the state. And I think making sure that we find ways through digital teaching and virtual learning to make sure we're enriching their experiences, especially for those students who may have limited access to devices or connectivity, so that everything's not virtual and that we have some real experiences for them to work on remotely if they're not in person.
Perfect. And so I'm going to reshare your contact information as you mentioned it before, so folks have a chance to get it, as well as the fact that I'd like folks to remember to complete the survey. Again, if you want credit for attending today's conference and this session in particular, we invite you to fill out that survey. But most importantly, that survey allows IBE to address any of the learnings that came from today's session and the conference throughout, so that we can plan for next year. So we appreciate your energy in completing that survey before the session ends. Lastly, again, you can see Robin LeClaire's contact information here, both her email and her direct number. As she indicated, she's open to answering questions that may come up even after today's conversation, so feel free to reach out to her directly. I'll give you one more second to complete that documentation for yourself and note her contact information, and then I will stop sharing our slide just to close out our conversation today. So again, Robin, thank you so much for your time today, and thank you for all of the material, the information. As a reminder to all participants today, the recording will be available on IBE's YouTube channel, and so feel free to look at that and share that with your colleagues, your staff, and others who might benefit from this great information on today. And we appreciate, Robin, your time today.
Thank you so much.
Your commitment to this work, and we appreciate all that you do for these children across the state, as well as the families and the staff and educators as well. Again, please do complete that survey, and we appreciate your time today. And note that that survey will be available in the chat box. Enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thank you.
Thank you.